Hello, it's David Wilkins again from Minnesota, ASALH, and this is the, I think, eighth in the series of short videos that we've put together to help you in your study of U.S. government. We're focusing on, I think you're still focusing on the court systems. In the last video, we looked at the Dred Scott opinion. I said that we would look at Dred Scott, we would look at Plessy versus Ferguson, which we'll do today, and we'll conclude with the ninth recording on Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So very, very important cases, all three. Quick refresher, Dred Scott was the lawsuit brought by Dred Scott claiming his right to be free. The Supreme Court in the decision, the notorious decision issued by Justice Taney, determined that Scott nor any other Black resident was a citizen of the U.S. and therefore had no right to sue, and indeed had no rights that any white person need respect. I made the point, tried to make the point that it was an overly broad decision. It was an unnecessary decision of the U.S. Supreme Court. Taney was intending to send a very clear message. He thought that it was going to resolve the slavery issue, when in fact it lit an additional fuse that, as I said, would ultimately lead to the U.S. Civil War. In his decision, in addition to denying the citizenship of people of African descent, he also ruled that the Congress had no right to limit slavery as they had done in the Compromise of 1820, uh, which would have limited the extension or expansion of slavery. Taney overruled that act, found it unconstitutional, and therefore gave the pro-slavers great encouragement to believe that they could, in fact, extend slavery throughout the U.S. And in fact, some thought they could enslave any Black person, and it terribly frustrated the anti-slavery abolitionist factor that would again drive the country toward a civil war. So the worst, clearly the worst U.S. Supreme Court case still to today. And we made that point. Plessy versus Ferguson is the second important U.S. Supreme Court case as it regards the treatment of the constitutional rights of Black people. This is a decision that would come in 1896. This is after the Civil War. Again, the war is fought 1861 to 1865, resulting in the Reconstruction era after the war, the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. The Reconstruction era, again, as we've said, is this opportunity, this 12-year or so opportunity for a true interracial democracy, which would end in about 1877 with the Compromise of 1877, which we've also examined, and the emergence of the redemption movements in the South. So again, the Redeemer movements, the white Southern Democrats through fraud and violence would retake control of the politics in the South and would deny people of African descent, Black people in the South and in the North, their constitutional rights, which leads us to Plessy versus Ferguson. It takes place in Louisiana. Homer Plessy is a octoroon. He is actually only 1/8 Black, but it is the plan of the civil rights group, the Committee of Citizens, who were testing the Jim Crow laws. There will be a video after the Plessy video that goes into Jim Crow particularly, but what you need to know is this group of citizens with Homer Plessy as their lead plaintiff was challenging the state of Louisiana and their rail car law, which essentially required the separation of white people from black people. That's the essence of Jim Crow, of segregation, and Plessy was challenging that. So he boarded the train, identified himself actually as a black person, a person of color, and when he refused to leave, he was arrested. That led to a court case in Louisiana, where Judge Ferguson would rule against Plessy. Ultimately, the case would get to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the argument made by Plessy and the plaintiffs and their lawyer Albion Turgee, a very well-known white abolitionist from Ohio, was that indeed these laws, these state laws, violated the 14th Amendment. You'll see in the video I'll show in a minute that the Supreme Court would find indeed that separate but equal was not a violation of the 14th Amendment. So again, another tragic decision from the Supreme Court, because it would, as I said last week, legitimize this period of Jim Crow segregation, legalize segregation that would last until the civil rights era in the middle of the 20th century, with the passage then of new civil rights acts and the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Interestingly, in his argument, Turgee was making the case that this was that these separate but equal laws, these Jim Crow laws, were akin to the badges of slavery that had been dealt with through the passage of the 13th Amendment. And that, in fact, separate could not be equal. Justice Brown for the Supreme Court obviously rejected that argument, and he wrote, "We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it." So again, this was a 7-1 decision. The Supreme Court, again, aligning itself with the segregationist, with the obviously influenced by the Southern politics and the spread of this Jim Crow legalized separation throughout the country. The sole dissenter, Justice John Marshall Harlan, he would become actually known as the Great Dissenter. In his dissent, has written to say the judgment this day rendered will in time prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision made by this tribunal in the Dred Scott case. So in his dissent, John Marshall Harlan would hearken back to the tragedy of the Dred Scott case, warning the court that indeed this was another bad decision. But let's stop for a moment. Let me share with you another of the Hip Hughes videos on separate but equal.
Welcome to Hip Hughes History. I'm so glad to be here with you right now. I was actually talking to a kid who was in kind of an advanced class, and we were talking about civil rights, and the kid didn't know the separate but equal doctrine. So I came this close to quitting my job and going to go work at Dunkin' Donuts, where I don't have to deal with this nonsense. But nevertheless, let's explain really the foundations of civil rights in the United States. Just in a couple minutes, really basic information here. So, of course, you know that slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment, and most people are familiar with the basic concept of the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, a change in federalism, giving the federal government really the ability in the future to enforce equality in the states when they're not doing it for their citizens. So, basically, in 1866, there was a Civil Rights Act passed also that kind of gave teeth to the 14th Amendment, saying we really mean business here. And then the southern states were like, screw you, we're going to do it anyway. This is Jim Crow, of course, and this is accelerated after 1877, the Compromise of 1877, which withdrew the Union troops and really allowed the South to kind of fester by itself and do what it wanted to. So by 1896, and now we're getting to the separate but equal doctrine, the Supreme Court hears the case Plessy versus Ferguson. And this court case is in Louisiana. Remember, the 14th Amendment deals with states. So we're dealing with the state of Louisiana, but we're creating a precedent for the whole country. And in Louisiana, they have a law called the Separate Car Act. And of course, this is Jim Crow 101, segregation. They are making black and white people ride on separate train cards. And Plessy, Homer Plessy, actually was, I believe, only 1/8 black. He looked white. He was the test case. He was chosen to challenge this law. And they probably thought that he'd have a better chance of winning if he looked white. But nevertheless, he's arrested. And then this court case makes its way up to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court says, which is just kind of unbelievably ridiculous, is that although the cars are separate, they still can be equal, separate but equal. So therefore, the state of Louisiana, i.e. Jim Crow, is not in violation of the 14th Amendment. And the separate but equal doctrine is the federal legal justification or rationalization to allow for Jim Crow to fester in all of these states. And of course, segregation in schools and water fountains and hospitals and fill in the blanks in life. And that's because of the separate but equal doctrine. Now, fast forward to 1954, 1955, and we have the reverse court case. And remember, all of this is unwritten, too. It's important to understand that judicial review is interpreting the Constitution, and that comes from Marbury versus Madison. But nevertheless, we all believe in it, and if we believe in it, it's real, and this has a dramatic effect on society. So in 1955, we have a court case involving the Board of Ed in Kansas, Topeka, and the segregation of black and white children in school. And they are doing that, of course, resting their marbles on Plessy, that this is allowable, separate but equal. Black is white, up is down, water is dry. Just saying it makes it true, of course, and we know it's not true. The schools aren't equal, the trains aren't equal, nothing's equal. It's a violation of the 14th Amendment, pure and simple. And when the Supreme Court hears Brown, they're going to reverse themselves. And there's other factors you can learn about the court case. They looked at psychological testing about the effects on the black child and the white child in terms of what happens when you segregate people and you say some are better than others because of the conditions that they are given and their opportunities. I'm talking too much. Separate is inherently unequal. That is Brown. Reversal of separate but equal doctrine. Separate is inherently unequal. And now that is really the beginning of the dismantling of Jim Crow. And we're going to have to fight like hell. There's going to be bus boycotts and sit-ins and freedom rides and new laws and all kinds of, desegregation orders. And Eisenhower's going to have to bring the military in to make sure that in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, that Brown versus Board is put forth into the schools, enforcing the law. But that's it, separate but equal doctrine. If you don't know the separate but equal doctrine, and you are in a U.S. history course, if you don't know it, don't show up to the exam. You need to play hooky. So there you go, guys. Hip Hughes History, man. Subscribe. If you haven't subscribed, you can win a puppy dog.
All right, I'm going to stop Hip Hughes there. We'll come back to him. I've got a second video that I'm going to tag on the end of this in case Ms. Sherrill decides she wants to broaden your discussion of Jim Crow and separate but equal. Let me just conclude by reminding you that this separate but equal doctrine, so the doctrine of legal segregation, was the legal framework, but never lose sight of the fact that there were social dynamics, violent social dynamics that were used all across the country. So this, like slavery, did not just exist in the South, but indeed this legalized segregation practice was practiced across the nation. Violence was the form of enforcement. And so, again, the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and groups like this were used to enforce this legal statute. So obviously the courts were supporting this, but the entire society, the white society, in an effort to support a white supremacist culture, would use violence and very, very public violence to enforce this institutionalized racism. So I'm going to end here with my comments. There is a longer video I will add on to the end of this. Should Ms. Sherrill decide to use it, she can do that. It just goes into greater detail, again, about the history of Jim Crow, again, leading through to Brown versus Board and the changes that, again, would reverse Plessy versus Ferguson, and the Brown decision in the civil rights cases and statutes in the middle of the 20th century. So let me add that clip on here if I can pull it up. Let's see. All right.
Warning, if you do not know the significance of the 14th Amendment, watch at your own risk. A 14th Amendment video is linked in the description for your learning convenience.
Hey guys, welcome to Hip Use History. We're going to take a quick look at the term Jim Crow, its meaning, its influence, its impact on the United States of America, because you need to know, whether you're a kid in school, whether you're a lifelong learner, or whether you're cray-cray on the internet, understanding Jim Crow should be a requirement of citizenship. So let's talk a little bit about the origin of the word Jim Crow before we go into kind of the concept of de jure and de facto segregation. Jump Jim Crow was an old song and dance routine that originated in 1828, which was written by a white comedian by the name of T.D. Daddy Rice, who would perform in blackface, basically to make fun of slaves.
Wheel about and turn about and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow.
The term Jim itself is short for Jimmy, like I'm going to Jimmy a lock, and that was a crowbar. So a crowbar in the 1800s was sometimes called a Jim or a Jimmy. And then, of course, crow itself was used as a term for blacks as early as the 1700s. In terms of jump Jim Crow, farmers used to feed their crows corn-soaked whiskey. Then the crows would get drunk and kind of dance around, not being able to fly as the farmers, kind of beat the crows to death. So there's multiple meanings behind the term Jim Crow. They all refer in a negative connotation to slaves and to freedmen, to blacks. And now we're going to turn that term Jim Crow into a system of racial oppression. So Jim Crow laws, and that would be segregation de jure, meaning that by jurisdiction, local and state ordinance, and we're also going to talk about federal ordinances, which mandate by law segregation. Now, early on, right after the Civil War, and that's where we're going to start in 1865, we still had those Southern governments that were being controlled by kind of Confederate forces. So those Southern white Democratic dominated legislatures would pass something called black codes right after the Civil War that severely limited the rights of these new freedmen. And most of these black codes were based on vagrancy laws, where if you were black, you had to prove that you had a job, and that job was recognized by whites. And if you couldn't do that, you would be forced into labor. You could be put in prison and then kind of, leased out to people in order to do jobs. So many historians have called black codes slavery by another name. But that's going to change during Reconstruction, because starting in 1867, the Republican-dominated Congress is going to basically mandate, through the enforcement of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment, the military occupation of the South. This is the period of history from basically 1867 to 1877, about a decade, called Reconstruction. And during Reconstruction, the black codes were eliminated. And for the most part, African Americans were allowed to vote. And you did have African Americans that were elected to high office. You had governors. There was an African American senator. There were African American state legislators. So it was kind of working, but of course, it's all being held together by military occupation. And then there was an incident in Louisiana in 1873 called the Colfax Massacre. And this is really kind of the Southern Democratic forces trying to coalesce around groups in order to take back what they see as their rightful place as leaders of these Southern governments. And in Louisiana, at the Colfax Massacre in 1873, there was a group called the White League. And this White League League, unlike the Klan, which was kind of a terrorist under the ground organization, the White Leagues and the Red Shirts, groups throughout the South, were open about their, opposition to African American rights and their wanting of power. So at Colfax, this White League basically attacked a courthouse that was being held by Republican forces. And we basically have a mini civil war at Colfax. We ended up having about 150 African Americans that were murdered, maybe more. We're not really sure about mass graves and people that were thrown into the river and such. But that culminated in a federal trial with the conviction of some of those people who did that based on the 1870 Enforcement Act, saying that Congress is going to have the ability to prosecute people that are violating the rights of freedmen. In 1876, the Supreme Court comes out with a decision called United States versus Cruikshank, where they basically kind of take the teeth out of the Enforcement Act by saying that because this White League was not a government group but a private organization, the Enforcement Act didn't hold, that private groups could discriminate. You had to get them a different way. You probably had to use state and local courts, which weren't going to work back then. So that's kind of a breakdown of federal control over the Southern governments and the rise of what's going to become Jim Crow. And then really it all falls apart in the election of 1876. You can watch, there's a video on the Compromise of 1877. You can click down in the description below to watch that. But basically there is a deal in the presidential election where the Southern Democrats kind of give their votes to the Republicans in Rutherford beat Hayes. Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, lost, even though he was from New York. That's another story. But the sticking point, the compromise, the sellout, is going to be the end of military occupation in the South by Reconstruction forces, that they're going to be able to own their governments again. And this is really the beginning of the birth of Jim Crow and segregation de jure down South. So let's take a look at some of the specifics of what Jim Crow laws we're talking about and how they're going to affect freedmen, African Americans in the South as they seek to claim the mantle of the American dream. Now, Congress wasn't done in the 1870s. They passed something called the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which was basically kind of a reclaim to the 14th Amendment in terms of public accommodations, that there would be no segregation in places of public accommodations like restaurants and hotels and trains and all of that kind of jazz. But that's going to be torn apart in 1896 with Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson isn't based on schools, even though Brown versus Board of Ed is going to overturn it. It's really based on the concept of segregation by legislation. And in Louisiana, it was always illegal for blacks and whites to ride up the same car. But the Separate Car Act of Louisiana kind of added coloreds to the mix. They had a classification for mixed races. And if you were 1/8 of African ancestry, you were considered colored and you couldn't ride on the train. So this was an organized effort by the black and colored community to fight this new law. And Homer Plessy, who was 1/8 black, he was very of light complexion, kind of walked onto the train one day and he had to announce to the steward of the train his racial heritage because nobody could tell just by looking at him. Then he proceeded to sit down and get arrested, in the spirit of Rosa Parks, which launched the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, where the court is going to end up saying separate is equal, that segregational laws are constitutional because they're still giving African Americans a seat at the table. It's just a separate table and it's an equal table. And of course, we all know that not to be true. So Jim Crow itself, in terms of segregation de jure, is going to be the laws that are passed, which are going to segregate African Americans from whites. So following Plessy versus Ferguson, the South kind of has legislative and judicial authority to segregate. And they're going to do that rapidly by passing laws, Jim Crow laws, which are going to segregate not only the public schools, but libraries and hospitals and transportation and all of that jazz. The other big, huge segregation de jure piece is going to be voting restrictions. And you can only have to look at Louisiana to see the effect that Jim Crow is going to have on voting rights. We talked about this before. Louisiana had African-American representation. They were being elected to high office, all the way up through the 1870s. By 1900, there's only a couple hundred African-Americans that are registered to vote. Only 0.5 of the African-American population had registered registered to vote that could vote. And in fact, in North Carolina, it was 0. No African Americans registered to vote. How did they do this? They did this by passing a series of poll taxes, meaning that you had to pay to vote. And that got a huge majority of the African American population from being able to vote because they simply couldn't afford it. And then they had literacy and comprehension tests where you had to put, pen to paper and prove that you were smart enough to vote. Now, you might ask, well, there were certainly a lot of poor whites that couldn't read and write, so how did they get away with it? They had something called grandfather clauses, where if you could prove your ancestry, your grandfather voted, that you were allowed to vote. And of course, African Americans don't have that luxury because of slavery. So that's how they did it. And now that is a humongous, humongous thing, because that means that if African Americans can't vote, their interests are not going to be served. They're not going to be in any type of powerful situation where their voice is going to be heard. Their interests are going to be served. So they are literally going to get swept under the rug. And of course, we could also talk about the effect in terms of cultural, social, psychological effect on African Americans. I don't even want to talk about all of the lost opportunity, all of the poets we didn't get to read, all of the scientific inventions that didn't get invented, all of the books that weren't written, all of the songs that were never heard. Because of course, Jim Crow is putting a kibosh on that, because it's literally putting a plug in the hose of opportunity. I don't know if that analogy works, but I think that you get what I mean. Now, it's not just state and local. That's the majority of it. And we're not even talking about segregation de facto, just segregation by custom. And of course, in the South, this means, calling everybody sir, crossing the road if a white person is coming at you. There were even customs where if you pulled up to a stop sign, you had to let the white guy go, even if he got to the stop sign after you. I kid you not. And this is, of course, not just regulated to the Southern hemisphere of the United States. We have segregation de facto in the North. We have banking policies and housing policies and all kinds of different private customs, which are going to put African Americans in a different category in the North as well. But of course, it's more widespread in the South. We also have federal Jim Crow, federal segregation, and we're going to put the blame squarely on maybe one of the most racist presidents, a Democrat by the name of Woodrow Wilson. Even though Woodrow Wilson was the head of Princeton in New Jersey, and people tend to think of him as a progressive, he may have been a progressive in some respects, but he was born down in Virginia, before the Civil War. So he's the first Southerner to be elected to the presidency of the United States since the Civil War. And one of his first things that he's going to do, he's going to segregate the federal workplace. He's going to segregate the Army. In fact, if you were applying for a position in the Wilson administration, you had to send a photo just to make sure you were of the right, skin color. So Wilson and the Democrats are just as guilty as the Democrats in the South on a state and local level of kind of making this happen. So we've talked a little bit about, Jim Crow in terms of segregation de jure and a little bit of segregation de facto. There's lots more that we could talk about. And of course, the enforcement of at least segregation de facto and I guess segregation de jure is happening through the use of terrorist organizations like the KKK, which are widespread throughout the early 20th century, which are going to use intimidation, humiliation, and violence to make sure that African Americans are put in their place, that they're not fighting back. But why don't we start talking about kind of the slow road to the end of this, century Jim Crow system of racial oppression. So we're going to get to the good stuff in a moment. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the civil rights movement as most people understand it in terms of Martin Luther King and Montgomery and Selma and all of the laws that are passed. But one of the earlier origins of the fight against Jim Crow and segregation occurs on the federal level. And there was an incident in 1946 called the blinding of Isaac Woodward Jr., where a member of the armed services, an African-American, Isaac Woodward, who had just been honorably discharged, literally a few hours later, had an incident with the sheriff department where he was beaten to a bloody pulp, where he was basically blinded. And that caught the attention of the nation. And there were popular songs written about it. Woody Guthrie, one of my favorite musical people, wrote a song called The Blinding of Isaac Woodward. This caught the attention of the Truman administration, who forcefully went after the guys who did this, one of the sheriffs in the sheriff's department, the local police. They were then tried in a federal court in South Carolina where it happened. And of course, you know what happened. They were all found not guilty by an all-white jury. This probably changed Harry Truman's approach. Immediately after that, he starts giving speeches to the NAACP. He puts civil rights on the radar, and he issues two executive orders, 9880 and 9881. And using his power of the presidency, he wipes away Wilson's action, desegregating the Army and desegregating the federal workplace. That's really the first big movement we have in terms of knocking down Jim Crow. And of course, that's at the federal level. The southern states are going to be much slower to respond. So we're going to have, darn it all, a civil rights movement based on the concept of nonviolence. And of course, most people associate this with Martin Luther King, the Baptist preacher from Alabama, who's going to be the spiritual leader of the civil rights movement. And of course, that's going to really begin in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955 and 1956, where Martin Luther King, using what he's learned from kind of the teachings of Jesus and Mahatma Gandhi of nonviolence, to do the bus boycott, which is successful. It was successful. They desegregated the buses. They showed African Americans and progressive whites that they could use their power as citizens to boycott and to engage in civil disobedience in order to change the law. So that's eventually going to lead, of course, we all know about the I Have a Dream speech in Washington in 1963. There's lots I'm skipping, guys, by the way, but that's going to result in the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, court cases like the 1967 Loving versus Virginia court case, which is going to legalize interracial marriage throughout the South. And we're going to slowly start chipping away at Jim Crow through federal action and through Supreme Court decisions, not to mention the biggest one that I skipped, which is the reversal of Plessy versus Ferguson, the 1954 court case, Brown versus Board of Education, where the court is going to rule down that separate is inherently unequal, which is going to begin the process of desegregating schools throughout the South, not private institutions. That's going to happen through federal legislation, kind of a repeat of the Civil Rights Act of 1875 and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is going to use the Interstate Commerce Clause to kind of broaden the scope of ending segregation. So it's including public accommodations, hotels, restaurants, and such like that. That's going to be challenged in the heart of Atlanta Motel versus United States, where the court is going to upheld the Civil Rights Act of 1964, really striking down segregation in the Southern Hemisphere of the United States. And of course, that's going to be followed up in 1965 when King and the civil rights forces focus on voting rights. They get the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which is going to basically put voting registration and elections under an umbrella of federal oversight to make sure that these places that are discriminating aren't doing that as much, and African Americans are going to be able to vote again and start to participate in the American democracy. In 1968, we get the Federal Housing Act, which is, of course, addressing the housing discriminatory practices that are occurring out throughout the United States. And that's pretty much the end of big federal legislation to attack the heart of Jim Crow. So there you go, guys. That was quick and simple. We're giving you really the direct explanation of Jim Crow. There's so much more to learn and to understand, which I highly encourage you to do. Hopefully you wrapped your brain enough to understand the significance of Jim Crow and the impact it had on the United States for generations to come. So there you go, guys. Giddy up for the learning. We hope that your brain is a little bit bigger than when you started before. We certainly
All right, I'm going to stop. Again, this additional longer clip is a broad discussion of Jim Crow. It incorporates Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board, which we will deal with specifically in the 9th of our series of clips. And I'll leave it again to Ms. Sherrill as to whether she wants to add on this lengthier piece. The Supreme Court, the third branch of our government, through these three cases, certainly Dred Scott and Plessy and ultimately Brown, demonstrate the importance of this third branch and how bad decisions impact our society. There obviously will be many good decisions like Brown that will reverse some of those, the negative impacts of those bad decisions. But let's stop for now, and look forward to visiting with you again when we discuss Brown versus the Board of Education.